Hi, boys and girls. Let's review our words again. O-R, porch, scorch, horn. O-A, moan, float, cloak. O consonant E, choke, phone, globe. And O-R-E, score, shore, chore. I hope you've been studying very hard this week. Your test is tomorrow. All right, let's review. Remember, biography, the true story of someone's life. Emancipate means to set free. And then jealousy, what word we've had again. That horrible feeling that you have when you want something that someone else has, right? You're green with envy. You're feeling jealousy. And we're going to see how jealousy plays into this chapter today. All right, we're going to continue with Abraham Lincoln by Augusta Stevenson. And today we're going to read School-butter. And here's a really neat picture before we start of Mom and Sarah and little Abe. And you can barely see him, but Dad's sitting in the corner over here. School-butter. Sarah and Abe were ready for their first day of school. They were so excited they scarcely knew what they were doing. Sarah had braided her 2 pigtails 4 times. Abe had combed his hair 5 times. Sarah wore her new dress out of linsey woolsey that her mother had woven and made. She was barefooted and bareheaded. Her pigtails hung down her back. Abe wore his new pants. They were linsey woolsey too, like his shirt, and had been woven and made by his mother. He wore a coonskin cap, but he was barefooted like Sarah. Both children were clean as soap and water could make them. Here are 2 corn dodgers for your dinner, said Mother. Put them in your pocket, Sarah. Dinner is lunchtime, okay? If you children want berries, you can pick them at noon. There are plenty in the woods around the schoolhouse. May I carry your speller, Sarah? Asked Abe as he reached for the book. I don't care, said Sarah. Just then, Mr. Lincoln came in. Sarah, he said, tell the schoolmaster that I will buy a speller for Abe soon, the next time I go to a sale. He can study with you for a week or so. Don't I need a reader too? Asked Sarah. Not until you have finished your speller, said Mother. Be sure not to study it out loud, said Father. The teacher won't know if... Be sure to study it out loud, said Father. The teacher won't know you are studying if you don't. All right, said Sarah. I will. I will too, said Abe. It's time for you children to start now, said Mother. You must not be late on the first day. She kissed them, and then Father patted Abe's black head and Sarah's brown one. The children followed the path across the clearing and into the woods. Soon they were out of sight. Mrs. Lincoln wiped the tears from her eyes. It's so far for them to walk, she said. 3 miles every day, and the path is rough. It can't be helped, Nancy. They are lucky to go to school at all. There are several children around here who can't afford to go. We can't really afford to send the children ourselves, said Nancy. I'll do extra work this winter, said Thomas. Carpenter work. I think I'll make enough to pay the schoolmaster. I can synthesize here to understand time better. We know that Sarah had a speller, but Abe did not, and that neither of them had a reader. They had no shoes, and now we see that the Lincolns have to pay the teacher themselves. So if I put all these things together, I can say that the school must have been very important to them because they were sacrificing, paying money that they might have used for other things to make sure that the kids got to go to school. I hope you will, Nancy said. I'm so anxious for the children to learn. Yes, said Thomas. They should learn to read and write. After school, late that afternoon, Sarah came home from school alone. Mother, Father, she cried as she hurried into the cabin. Abe's gone. Gone, said Father. Gone where? I don't know, said Sarah. Then she began to cry. Come, dear, don't cry, Mother said. Sit here by me on the bench. Now then, tell us what happened. Just as school was out, said Sarah, we heard some boys outside calling names at us. At you and Abe? Mother asked. No, said Sarah, at all of us. I couldn't understand what they said, but they made the schoolboys mad. Was it School-butter? Asked Father. Yes, that was it. Then they ran, and our boys ran after them, and Abe went too. Abe went? Cried Mother, alarmed. I told him not to go, but the boys called him. I guess he thought he had to go. Mrs. Lincoln was frightened. The big boys will run ahead and leave him, she said. He will get lost in the woods. I'll go after him, said Mr. Lincoln. Don't worry, Nancy. I'll find him. Then he ran out of the cabin. He didn't even stop to get his cap. Sarah cried again. I'm afraid Abe will fall in the creek, she said. Mother was afraid of that too, but she didn't want Sarah to know it. So she said, Father will find him. Now then, do you know why those boys called school-butter? No, Mother, I don't. They wanted to make fun of the children who go to school. Why? Asked Sarah. I think they really wanted to go to school themselves, but their folks can't afford to send them. So they pretend it's silly to go, sort of soft, like butter. Oh, yes, said Sarah. I understand. Now, let's get a good supper for Father and Abe. I'll make some flour biscuits, said Mother. Flour biscuits, Sarah cried, and her eyes nearly popped right out of her head. It will be a treat for all of us, said Mother. Please put these apples in the hot ashes, Sarah. Then you may fill in this gourd with maple sugar. Oh, said Sarah. Won't a good supper make Abe happy? Hunting Abe. Mr. Lincoln ran into the woods calling, Abe! Abe! There was no answer, so he ran up the trail towards the schoolhouse. Sometimes he stumbled over large tree roots. Once he caught his foot in a wild grapevine and fell. But in an instant he was up and running again. He kept on calling Abe, but there was only silence in the great forest. At last he reached the clearing where the log schoolhouse stood. There wasn't a boy or a girl. Sorry, my pages are sticking together. There wasn't a boy or a girl to be seen in the woods, so he went again. On and on up the trail he went. Abe, he called again and again. Abe, Abe, Abe. There was no answer, not even a glimpse of a little black-haired boy. It began to get dark in the woods, but still Mr. Lincoln went on. At last he stopped. Abe, Abe, where are you? He called once more, but there was no answer. Abe couldn't have come any farther, he said to himself. He couldn't walk any further. So he turned and he went back on the trail toward the schoolhouse. He hoped the schoolmaster would still be there. The two of them could go together to hunt for Abe. They would stop at every cabin along the creek and every neighbor would join them. They would all take torches and look in the creek. Mr. Lincoln came into the clearing and went into the schoolhouse. There sat the master at his desk writing. Mr. Riney, said Mr. Lincoln, I'm hunting Abe. He's lost. Look there, said Mr. Riney. He pointed to a bench. Mr. Lincoln looked. Abe was lying on it, sound asleep. So he wasn't really lost after all, was he? He ran after the boy, said Mr. Riney, and I came after him and brought him back. I was just getting ready to take him home. I'm much obliged to you, Mr. Riney, said Mr. Lincoln. That means I'm very thankful for you. I was afraid you might have fallen into the creek and been drowned. Then he went to the bench and tried to awaken Abe. First he shook him gently by the shoulder. Abe, Abe, he said, wake up, son. Abe opened his eyes, but he was still half asleep. School-butter, shouted the master. Then Abe awoke and jumped up. The men laughed. Abe laughed. Then Mr. Lincoln took Mr. Riney and Abe to a very, very good supper in the Lincoln cabin on Knob Creek. That's where we're going to stop for today. But let's talk about it. So how did the children look when they went to school? Well, they had on their best, except they didn't have shoes because obviously they don't have a lot of money. 3 miles. It's going to take them quite a long time to walk to school and from school every day. You think they were embarrassed not to have their books yet? But again, it couldn't be helped. They were even lucky to be getting to go. And everyone was worried about Abe because he went off with the big boys. But it turns out that the schoolmaster was smarter than the parents thought. So he went and he got Abe and he brought him back to the schoolhouse with him. And he knew Abe was too little to walk home by himself. So he was just let him stay at school while he finished up his work, and then he took him home. And the treats they were going to have for dinner, I would suspect that flour biscuits probably weren't something they got to have every day. Probably they cooked with corn more than they did flour, because flour they would have to go get, and corn, they grew corn, so the corn they could have right there. So anyway, so it was a special dinner, and the children had a good first day of school, and we'll read some more tomorrow. Thanks for listening.